I think it's time for another heart to heart. It's been over a year since I last posted. I have new hair. I'm in a new room, among other things. Many changes have gone down. And since I no longer use Instagram and I don't post anything online, it's been truly a break away from presenting myself in any performative way. So forgive me if I'm a little awkward or rusty. The purpose of my videos from here on out will be to talk about books and give book reviews and ideas and insights because I love them and because that's what I would like to do. I've been learning a lot and would like to share some things, anything that is interesting or I believe and think holds some wisdom that possibly our larger culture or online space might need or could benefit from. Because I know I see many things going on and I'm like, oh, no. Also, I know that not everybody's a reader or is keen on reading and the process of engaging with a full book, but would maybe enjoy the contents of certain things, or it would be enriching, and I don't want them to be left out. So I'll gladly do the reading and give the goods. I actually remember as a little girl walking as a class to the library and being read to by the librarian and thinking that that looked like so much fun to do. I think there's something to that, I think. So I'm just gonna follow it also because I'm feeling a pull on my heart to start speaking on these things and because I'm trying to be a more faithful person in my responses to God, I just have to start. All right. I hope to share also books that aren't typical ones going through BookTube. I want to find some hidden gems or ones that don't have as much of a spotlight on them. So there may be some like Stoner by John Williams, which is all the rage. It's everyone's favorite, which I did read, but it was good, but not like the best book I've ever read. Kind of actually made me a little irritated, to be honest. So yes, it will be a little bit of everything. Memoirs, nonfiction, fiction, things mostly centering a little bit on spiritual formation and theology because that feels very nourishing. Books regarding social engineering and mind control and sort of how we're being molded, how life forms us, and some of the forces that are contributing to that are not loving and good. They are on the more sinister front. The concept of human programming and mind control is always interesting to be aware of as a reality that exists, because ultimately it is your job to fortify yourself into being who you are as God created you to be against the pressures of society trying to make you into something else. You know, because being manipulated and degraded is not fun. All right, enough rambling. Let's get this rager started, shall we? The first book I will be talking about is called A Severe Mercy by Sheldon Van Auken. I don't know where that last name hails from. It's interesting. It is a memoir. He calls it an autobiography of a love story, and it includes a conversion to Christ from being more on the pagan spectrum or on the pagan worldview, devastating loss and grief, and he shared a friendship and a correspondence with C.S. Lewis that was very deep and interesting. it made me so nostalgic for a time that seems simpler, you know, before the tech stuff hit. And obviously it wasn't as simple because there were still world wars and all sorts of things going on. But, you know, it was still the days before the internet, and it just seems a little bit more wholesome. You know, things like sitting on a fence in the summer, drinking a neighbor's fresh glass of milk from the farm and eating strawberries while having a conversation about life and dreams. Wholesome like that, you know, walking under the stars and running through the fields. And it sparked so much of that desire for simplicity. And it was so beautiful, their love story and the way that they, as a couple and as a partnership, and eventually they got married, they said, and our trust in each other will not only be based on love and loyalty, but on the fact of 1,000 sharings, 1,000 strands twisted into something unbreakable. So this promise to just share all of these things, which is so different from the modern form of a relationship, which just feels like people just want their independence and then give a little bit here and there, and it's not so like entwined. And it's more of like this power struggle, who gets to be more dominant, which is very unromantic in almost every way. And that's why relationships for a lot of people are so unappealing at this point. And that's sad. He even mentioned they had something called an appeal to love, where usually if a conflict arose, conflicts were almost always between the willful self and love. It might be mentioned here that the most spirited feminist of later years could not easily fault a union based on sharing and the appeal to love in decision-making, a union where no one exercised authority and we did what was necessary to do, housework or sail mending, together as a part of sharing, not in the name of women's rights, but in the great name of love. Like, what a contrast to today with how people view relationships. And all anyone ever wants to talk about is their rights and all of the therapy, psychology lingo of boundaries and all of that. Anyway, the main reason why I wanted to review this book is because something really incredible happened as I was reading it. So in my past videos, I know I did one on awakenings. I know that I was trying to express certain things about what my own spiritual journey has been like as someone who's interested in the spiritual realm, and awakenings I've had, and all sorts of things. And I mentioned it, I think, in one of those past videos, but in 2022, I had a born-again experience when it comes to being a born-again Christian, and sort of the beginning of a process of sanctification. Now, I did not know at the time that that was what was happening. It was very disorienting, and there's all sorts of stuff that comes with that. But I now know it to be referred to as a conviction of sin moment, which, you know, if you have something happen and then a year later, after trying to understand what happened, you come across someone experiencing the same thing in a book at a totally different time, in a totally different life, and you go, oh, this is something that actually happens for people all around the world, all the time. It is a real event. And I think that when people talk about having a conviction of sin moment, or being saved by Jesus, or having a born again moment, all these more liberally oriented people just think that these are people who've been brainwashed, or are sort of, you know, like it's just something that stupid people end up doing. And, you know, the decision, well, it's actually not really a decision, because it's a moment when God finally gets to you, and gets to you in such a way that it like regenerates your heart, and it completely shifts your sense of identity, your view on the world and reality, and your view on human nature. It radically changed my feelings and thoughts and beliefs about human nature and what we're working with as human beings and mankind. So I'm just going to read this because it was interesting. And mind you, that before this moment had happened, I was a person also that if I had heard the word sin, or if people called themselves a sinner, I would be like, don't be so hard on yourself. That's what Catholics use to create guilt and shame. Like, you're not a sinner. You're a beautiful human being and you're just wounded. Like, that was my thinking, right? Okay. So he came home to find his wife. I came home to find her face streaked with tears, and she clung to me desperately and wept. And it was some time before she could try to tell me what had happened. Her sins, she said, had come out and paraded before her, ghastly in appearance and mocking in demeanor. What sins? What sins could this eager, loving creature have committed? Not sins as the world counts sins. Not one person had she murdered, nor one gold ingot stolen, no unfaithfulness, no secret drinking, no dishonesty, no sloth, no kicking dogs. But sometimes she had been grouchy or snappish. She had said cruel things to people, perhaps to her mother or brother. Once in the war, when a young officer, a friend who had been brought up Catholic, had said that someday he would no doubt return to the church, Davy had said with mocking scorn, "Whatever for? Not brave enough to stand alone?" And he had changed the subject. Now her words haunted her. Sin. She knew there was such a thing as plain sin, not something any psychiatrist could absolve or explain away. Even worse, the sins of omission. She was shaken to the depths, shaken as I had ever known her to be. I knew it had been a huge and dreadful experience. But how could I understand, I who had never known the like? For she was clearly not a sinner, merely human and the dearer for it. What she needed, what we both needed, was the sea and the sky, nature, to soothe our souls. So I held her and comforted her up against something I could not comprehend, but something I would help her fight. I know now, of course, that she had experienced the classical conviction of sin. Christianity knows all about it, but I didn't know all about Christianity. If I had actually understood what was happening, understood it as a spiritual process, I should have been wildly alarmed. Or again, if I had deeply understood, perhaps I shouldn't have been alarmed. But for deep understanding, I'd have had to have been a Christian. For the hound of heaven was after her, following after with unwearied pace. But I did not understand, neither did she, of course. But then, when all the world falls away one night, one doesn't quite forget the experience. Okay, I feel so silly reading like a whole page out of a book, but reading about that, about a young lady in maybe the 1940s or the 1950s, and just feeling like it was the exact same thing. Like I all of a sudden felt like sin was a reality. It was in our nature. And I all of a sudden was having all of these things bubble up in my mind that I had done that was sin. That was not good. It was not good behavior. It was rebellious against everything that was good. It produced a lot of guilt and shame and sorrow. And, and it's something that connects people in all different eras all through time. And I'm not sure that it's really understood by people who are really hostile towards religion. And for good reason, because obviously there is a lot about religion that's been corrupted and infiltrated and used for its own wicked and evil agenda. But that doesn't mean you throw Jesus Christ, the gospel, and this really mysterious regeneration of the heart that happens for people. You don't just throw all of that away. I'm all tongue-tied. So also, as I start speaking again, you may notice that I blush, and this is something that I will be victorious over. So I'm aware that this happens to me when I feel vulnerable and when I'm speaking from the heart, but it will not hold me back any longer. So yes, that was kind of one of the main reasons that I wanted to review this book, is because it was one of the things that made me feel like I wasn't going crazy, and that a conviction of sin and being born again and the beginning of a process of sanctification is a real beautiful thing that happens to people. It's not something I did, when I go do a heroic dose of mushrooms and have this like experience with oneness with life. This was more like God initiated me to get right with him. And it changes your life. Ultimately, it completely reroutes everything. He talks a lot also about his resistance to conversion, which I related to deeply. There's this part of having to put this old self, allow it to die so you can sort of regenerate into a new being that's moving towards the character of Christ. And that can be quite painful. And there's this sort of wrestling that you have with that process of like holding on to that past self, even though I can only speak also for me. I was very tormented, that version of me, so that I'm like romanticizing and sort of clinging on to all the patterns and habits I had is interesting. And God's, and especially Jesus is just like, let it go. And the Holy Spirit's trying to do its work, and we're just like, no, it's crazy. Yeah, I said I related to his resistance to truly surrender his life to that Trinitarian presence, preferring the pagan worldview, and all of that allows instead, because that allows life to feel like a playground. Whereas when you become a Christian, it turns into a battleground, and you have to be very mindful of the things that you allow into your thinking and your feeling and your spirit. But then ultimately he has profound moments where he says this, I could not reject God. And that's ultimately what kind of happens, is that if you do not follow this new thing that has started in you, that it's not gonna end well as you go through time. Like, you just cannot reject God. The longing for eternity is built into us all. Isn't that so beautiful? It's so true. And that's something that I feel about our society at this point now, is it's so secular. And so you just think about this being eternally minded as opposed to just doing everything for right now. And that shapes you differently. That changes your attitude about a lot of different things. And that's, I think, why certain secular answers to very spiritual problems just don't help. They don't work. You kind of just try all these different techniques while still having the same issue with eternity, really. But the way that he wrestles with the loss, spoiler alert, she dies. Spoiler alert, she does die very early, very young. And how he grapples with that is really profound and beautiful. And the way that he reframes it, whereas people that don't have this relationship with the Lord and this view of heaven and a beautiful outlook on what it's all about, it can be so dark. I have someone in my family currently that is atheistic, and it's very sad what happens when you don't believe in those heavenly things. So his outlook on her death ends like this. If my reasoning, my judgment is correct, then her death in the dearness of our love had these results. It brought me, as nothing else could do, to know and end my jealousy of God. It saved her faith from assault from me. And it brought me, if Lewis is right, her far greater help from eternity. And it saved our love from perishing in one of the other ways that love could perish. Would I rather not our love go through death than hate? I think you have to read the book to understand why he had framed it that way, because she had a really, really deep conversion to being a follower of Jesus, and he grappled with certain jealousies, and then that would affect their relationship. And so if that would have continued over time, he probably could have gotten more and more resentful, and their love would have deteriorated. Yeah, so feeling like ultimately the love that they had shared and the time that they had spent, and that was more than enough, as opposed to feeling angry at God for taking her from him. Which takes me to a quote by Oswald Chambers, that the root of all sin is the suspicion that God is not good. So no matter what you're dealing with, I know it can be quite difficult being a human, but that is sort of the big one, is being very, very persistent with knowing that God ultimately is good. And anything that is happening, even if it creates a lot of suffering, can be used for good, for the glory of the whole story of what this human situation on earth is about. I will leave you with that. I highly recommend this if you need something deep. All right, see you next time.